The remote island of New Caledonia is home to some of the most incredible geckos on the planet, including the humble Gargoyle Gecko. I adopted Cynthia here back in 2019. These are amazing geckos that unfortunately tend to be overshadowed by the more prolific crested gecko, and in my opinion, it shows. Although similar in many ways, their care isn't interchangeable, likely because of where they live. You see, the island is extremely biodiverse. It features many unique habitats, such as tropical forests where crested geckos can be found, and the shrublands gargoyle geckos typically inhabit. When Cynthia joined the family, I did what was pretty much standard practice at the time, making jungle habitats for her. The first was in a commercial enclosure that she came with, and the second in a custom-built plywood setup where she's thrived since. Other than minor differences, both were essentially the same as my crested gecko vivariums, and thus not representative of the aforementioned shrublands. I've wanted to change this for years, so join me as I attempt to capture the essence of the gargoyle gecko's natural habitat indoors. Information regarding New Caledonia geckos in the wild is sparse, especially gargoyles. In contrast to the forest understories that crested geckos inhabit, like this, Rhacodactylus auriculatus tend to live in a much different habitat, mining Mackie or the Mackie shrublands. It's a rugged biome located primarily on the southern part of the main island of Grand Terre. This environment is the byproduct of wildfire-induced forest retreat and an ultramafic rock foundation. Don't worry, I also had no idea what that meant. If I understand correctly, it's igneous rocks that are low in silica while having high concentrations of minerals like magnesium. Now I'm no geologist, so any watching this, feel free to elaborate, but the point is that this rocky foundation is responsible for the appearance of these lands. Hills and valleys are painted with rusty hues and peppered with pockets of unique plants only found here. Many of those are sclerophyllous, having leathery foliage able to withstand these harsh conditions. It's almost as if everything has been bone-side, with sparse foliage grouped at the ends of gnarled branches. Needless to say, the Mackie are a specific environment that differ greatly from where other popular New Caledonia geckos live. The lack of a dense canopy and overall more extreme conditions likely explain the differences in care, such as slightly higher temperatures and UV exposure, as well as why gargoyles are more agile and predatory. My goal is to combine this information with practical animal keeping in hopes to create something that looks the part while being a great home for Cynthia. When I set out to build this a year ago, it was meant to be in a single video alongside the nature-inspired crested gecko vivarium I recently shared. I later decided to separate them to better highlight the differences and to avoid dumping gargoyles in with cresties as I had in the past. I say this because I made Cynthia's enclosure in tandem with Delilah's. I outlined the process for that in the crested gecko video and will do a dedicated tutorial later, so I'll keep this part very brief. Creating a setup with a lot of variation and gradient of microclimates was my goal. To do that well, the enclosures had to be larger than my previous iterations, so I ended up building custom 90-gallon Euro-style vivariums measuring 24 inches wide, 24 inches deep, and 36 inches tall. To do that, I assembled glass panes much like I would in an aquarium, secured frames on the bottom and top, offset the substrate tray to provide front ventilation and thus make it a Euro-style setup, made a screen for the top, and drilled the bottom for an auto drain. I'd add a few other details later, but this is when I began working on the background. I wanted to build this with the same vertical concrete technique that I used in builds like this one for my African bullfrog, another for a cane toad, the ancient ruins Paludarium, and a milk snake. I like how well it holds details and how easy it is to use. Another layer I added to this was building without a foam backing like I typically would. Now I first tried this technique for a banyan tree background that I made for Delilah's tank. Since her tank is the same size as this one, I was able to reuse everything from the form. While these are foamless in the end, I still use it to build off of initially, and since my intention here was to mimic the Mackie, it would be much different than a tree. I felt that something resembling a muddy hillside embedded with rocks would probably be my best bet. These backgrounds only require a thin layer of concrete, roughly 3/4 of an inch thick. Rather than waste material or add unnecessary weight, I used foam and leftover plastic from a freight shipment to create the outline of rocks. I could then create all of the dirt texture on a flat surface, so this didn't need to be complex. A plastic sheet is ultimately what makes this foamless technique work. The shipping plastic in the rock structure is what I used for the tree, so I had to use a plastic drop cloth here instead. Concrete doesn't stick to this, and lining the foam lets you repeatedly remove and reuse the materials. This concrete works by combining it with a water-based cure promoter and water. Once mixed, it has a light, airy consistency. I found that creating a thin base layer of concrete or scratch coat roughly 1/2 of an inch thick is ideal for this foamless technique. It's not the part that gets detailed, so it only needs to capture the background's rough shape. The actual look and features are achieved in the additional layers. From here I worked in steps, beginning with the rocks. I painted the appropriate areas with primer to ensure the next layer would adhere properly. This layer also doesn't need to be very thick, just enough to capture details. Instead of carving most of it, I allowed actual stones to do the work for me. Pressing them into the concrete to capture reliefs greatly sped up the process. I should mention that if you're going to do this, use a few stones, or you may end up with an unintentional pattern. After capturing the initial details, I allowed it to firm up. Then I went along the edges with thin stones to create a dynamic, layered appearance. Although these real stones helped, manual carving was still required to fine-tune the look. I should probably also mention that in past Vivariums I had made panels to cover every side, but I only made one to maximize this tank's usable footprint. Typically I'd color the entire background at once after the concrete cures. However, for this one, I decided to color the rocks with these water-based glazes before creating the dirt. First I sprayed it with black, which I watered down and wiped away. This helps capture the fine cracks and details like a wash. After it dried, I covered it all with an olive hue for some subtle warmth. However, I wanted more irregularity, so I scraped spots with a wire brush to create highlights, then covered them with other glazes. I repeated this several times to achieve the desired effect. As for the dirt, I mixed the liquid components as usual, but before adding the crete, I dyed it with brick and brown pigments to create a different base color. I felt this was essential to capture the Mackie's rust-painted appearance. Otherwise, the process was more or less the same as before. I applied primer to the appropriate areas and pressed the concrete in. I kept things as irregular as possible as I did, even crumbling some over the top to create the initial dirt texture. From there, I scraped the entire surface with a little tool. While it takes some time, this creates the perfect texture with minimal thought. To better create the look of an eroded hillside as I did this, I decided to embed some maple roots. Now, I may have gone a little overboard with the brick, though I did find a few areas where the soil is actually this saturated. After curing and prior to coloring this further, I demolded the background. It's a pretty straightforward process. I simply cut off the exterior foam and then pull everything off the back. Had I not built this background at the same time as the other, I would have caught an error I had made on the form. It was slightly skewed, which prevented it from fitting in the tank. That meant I had to do some modifications with an angle grinder. Once I knew it fit, I proceeded to add color to the dirt. Various washes of brown and black were more than enough to make it appear less flat. I also saved all of the remnants that didn't make it onto the background. I colored them to match the rest of the dirt and would use them for other details later on. Between then and the install, several weeks passed, and actually installing it into the tank was simple. I just applied silicone to the parts that would touch the glass and moved it up into the tank. I felt that the end result resembled something that you may actually see in the Mackie, so I was pleased. This was also when I installed the bulkhead for the auto train. That means I can finally escape this setup, and for it to look the part, I need some branches with very specific characteristics. Thankfully, everything I need is right here in my backyard. When I look for driftwood outside, I search for pieces that are dry and stable. Occasionally stuff that's laying directly on the ground can work, but fallen trees with elevated limbs are ideal. That said, it's best to avoid greenwood. It's prone to rotting and can be harmful. Anyway, with how the Mackie form, large trees are virtually non-existent, so I was looking for thin branches. Furthermore, many of those trees would be pines, which aren't typically vivarium safe, but I did manage to find branches from other species that look close enough. With an appropriate selection, the next order of business was to cut them down to fit the enclosure's height. Despite having plenty of usable horizontal space, I find that Cynthia typically perches and basks in a vertical position. I would still provide horizontal spaces in this one, but I focused more on clustering vertical branches together to mimic the base of a bush thicket. Thanks to a great selection, that all happened with relative ease. However, using wood from outside without additional steps to address pests and pathogens isn't wise, so I took a reference image before removing everything. I prefer to boil driftwood on the stove, but these pieces were too large for that. I also don't care for the oven method, and they wouldn't fit on my grill, so I got a large outdoor stock pot specifically for boiling hardscape. Even so, these pieces were too long to boil at once, and I had to work in steps. First, I boiled them for around 2 hours, let them cool, flipped them around, and boiled them for an additional 2 hours, for a total time in water of roughly 5 to 6 hours. Once dry, they could return to the tank. In no time at all, I was able to get everything back to the way it was, with a few minor alterations. As I did this, I also secured them from the outside of the screen with stainless steel screws. However, as I was doing that, I had another thought. Since the Mackie shrublands are prone to wildfires, why not char a few of the branches? I thought it could look pretty cool. Even though I wanted to minimize its use in the enclosure, I still used pond foam to secure the base of the branches. I later removed excess to make room for substrate. As is, the charred branches likely would have been an issue because as you can see here, it came off to the touch. I didn't want that to get all over Cynthia, but the solution was simple. I had to rinse down the enclosure to remove debris anyway, which I'm sure helped. However, scrubbing these areas down is what did the real work. Anyway, all of that set the stage for what would happen next. Something I hadn't mentioned before is that I arranged some of the branches to create a faux plant. Remember those sclerophyllus plants I talked about before? Well, many are endemic to this area and found nowhere else on the planet. One such plant is Dracophyllum verticillatum. There are plants that resemble it, but rather than use those, I decided to combine the hardscape with air plants to mimic its appearance. I was able to wedge larger ones between the branches and secure others with gel superglue. I later used crushed aqua soil to create a smooth transition between them and the branches. You can see what I mean here, and despite being what it is, I think it looks close to the Dracophyllum. What do you think? Before adding the remaining plants, I installed the lights, an LED grow light, and a 6% UVB. This was also when I added a misting nozzle and an adjustable circulation fan which will run a few times throughout the day to keep the air from becoming stagnant. Then I created the false bottom. I selected Leca for its moisture retaining properties that will help maintain humidity. Thanks to the auto drain which I covered with a mesh barrier, a thick layer wasn't necessary. After all, the primary job of this layer is to keep standing water separate from the substrate, and with a drain, it can only fill up so much. Inevitably, some amount of substrate will end up in this layer, but it does need a barrier. I used carbon filter mats. Fitting multiple pieces together and cutting them around the hardscape worked, but it left gaps where substrate could seep into the false bottom. Sphagnum moss was sufficient to plug these areas, though expanding foam would have been more thorough. That meant it was finally ready for substrate. It's a blend of orchid bark, cocoa fiber, sphagnum moss, aqua soil, sand, and charcoal. I know how it should look and feel, so I typically don't measure out the components, but I'll leave the ratios up on screen if you're curious. It doesn't have to be exact, so long as it remains fluffy when wet. Doing so promotes healthy soil conditions for beneficial bacteria, the cleanup crew, and the plants. A nice thing about such a tall tank is that even with a substantial layer of substrate, it didn't appear to take up much of the usable space. While the dwarf umbrella tree wouldn't be found in the gecko's habitat, I felt that it resembles plants that do. Plus I've used them with the geckos before and they hold up well. I removed all of the substrate from the roots and thoroughly sprayed down the entire plant. I looked everywhere at the time and all I was able to find was a variegated Schefflera, which I was reluctant to use at first. However, I actually think it adds something to the setup that a non-variegated one couldn't. I also think this plant kind of acted like glue, bringing the entire vision full circle. However, this dried grass was a close second. They didn't last in the setup they came from, and grasses are in the Mackie, so I figured I'd use them here. Something nice with Delilah's setup is that the food dish fit perfectly in the vines. I didn't have anything like that for this one, so I connected a few of those scraps to create a food dish mount. I just had to mix up some aquarium epoxy and stick it to the background. While that stabilized, I figured I might as well install the glass tracks with waterproof mounting tape. I also used the rest of those scraps to add variation to the back. I removed the grass so I could see what I was doing with them. I will say that they ended up being visually pointless, but they'd at least provide refuge for isopods. However, it wasn't their time yet. I like to add the springtails first, so any charcoal that falls out of their culture becomes a part of the substrate first. Then I concealed them with various leaves and seed pods. I collected most of these from outside, boiling them in that stock pot from earlier before use. These, along with a few cork bark branches, will provide refuge and food for the cleanup crew. Their primary job is to clean up after Cynthia, and without hiding places like these, they'd likely not have stable enough populations to perform their job. However, this will also give prey items like crickets places to hide, which I like to believe helps stimulate Cynthia's hunting instincts. By this point, there were only a few more things to add, like a ceramic heat emitter. I always like to do so with a failsafe, so I drilled some holes in this branch to inconspicuously mount a thermostat's temperature probe and ensure it doesn't exceed safe limits. It's probably also worth mentioning that the heat shuts off completely at night. Despite what I had said before, I felt that the scape could also benefit from more horizontal variation, which I achieved with the manzanita branches from Cynthia's old setup. Their dried, rustic appearance fit the theme well, and I didn't even need to mount them with anything. I was able to wedge them between other elements to keep them stable. That meant it was ready for the doors. Finally, I added little bumpers near the bottom for handles, thus completing the build phase of this vivarium. With all of the work behind us, we can finally see what Cynthia's going to think of her new home. My time with this gecko has been different from others. You see, Cynthia has been quite skittish ever since I adopted her. Nevertheless, I've worked with her over the years, and I believe the upgraded housing arrangements often correlate with progress. The fact that I was able to hold her for all of these clips in front of a studio light and release her without any franticness speaks volumes. It truly is night and day from the beginning. This time she clung to this branch before climbing to another to gain a different vantage point. Eventually she leaped to another to do the same, ultimately finding her way over to a branch near the hot spot. Later that evening she began venturing out, and in the days following she seemed to adapt quite well to her new surroundings. My hope with this setup and the adjoining crested gecko vivarium was to capture the essence of their natural habitats while providing them with better homes than I have before. I doubt they care whether it looks the part or not though. Either way, there's something special about seeing them in homes inspired by nature. I think it helps tell their story more completely. What the geckos do and why is dictated by where they originate. Having them live in a better representation of that provides more concise talking points when sharing the animals, which I like to believe makes it easier for non-reptile people to appreciate these amazing and often overlooked animals. Aesthetics aside, having naturally occurring features like many vertical branches helps stimulate a broader range of behaviors and, in turn, creates more confident animals that respond positively to human interactions. If they feel safe, they tend to be more likely to let you into their world. With that, I want to say that while I personally prefer large enclosures like this, setting them up well with many usable features and habitat variation is essential. Otherwise, the potential benefits of a larger space will actually have the opposite effect, making the animal feel vulnerable. Observing, understanding, and getting in tune with your animals really helps with this. Taking an iterative approach with animal keeping by continuing to improve my care for them as I learn more is easily one of my favorite parts, and trying to recreate their natural habitats adds a fun challenge. While I'm sure I'm not the first to do it, I've never seen a Mackie-inspired vivarium quite like this. It was a lot of fun to create over the past year, and a good excuse to make something new for Cynthia. If you like this project, you'll also enjoy the nature-inspired crested gecko vivarium and the cypress swamp I tried to recreate for a tiny turtle. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.